like to now introduce my very good friend Ahmet Kuru, and I've been following him for quite some time, and we follow each other on Facebook and also on Twitter, and I've been reading his articles, and we see eye to eye on almost on all issues, and that's why when I requested Ahmet to talk to us, he readily agreed, and here he is today. So I must thank Ahmed first of all for accepting my invitation, and despite being very early in San Diego, where he is located, is 6:15 there now, or 6:20 there right now, and yet he has found time to wake up early, and I don't know, he's sitting without a breakfast there. I'm sure he's just on some snacks and tea or coffee, and that shows the commitment for a cause, commitment to take the liberal and moderate view of Islam across the globe. So we really salute you for that, Ahmed, for being there so early. You know, it's 6:15 and 6:30. Before 6:30 is it's not easy. Thanks a lot, Ahmed. And for those who don't know Ahmed, most of us know him. Of course, Mike knows him, being in Washington himself. I'd like to read out a brief biography of Ahmed. He's author of two very interesting books and both award-winning. He had his PhD from the University of Washington, and right now he's the Porteous Professor of Political Science at San Diego State University, and he was a postdoctoral scholar at Columbia University earlier, and also the author of, as I said, two interesting books. One is titled "Secularism and State Policies Toward Religion: The United States, France, and Turkey." This was again published with the Cambridge University Press in 2009. And this was also awarded the Society for Scientific Study of Religion. It received this award. And after that, he co-edited a book with Alfred Stepan titled Democracy, Islam, and Secularism in Turkey. This was published by the Columbia University Press in 2012. And after that, he has been contributing a lot of articles. Till recently, he wrote this wonderful book, which I'm right now going through, and which also happens to be the title of our talk today: Islam, Authoritarianism, and Underdevelopment: A Global and Historical Comparison. Again, Cambridge University published it last year, and it won the American Political Science Association's International History and Politics section's Best Book Award. Congratulations, Ahmed, for that. You know, and it's not easy to win awards with both your books and almost all the articles which he has published, all wonderfully argued, and I mean, you know, difficult to argue against those articles. Yesterday, he sent me an article on blasphemy again, which I have circulated it on our forum too, Ahmed. I'm sure people will appreciate that. Therefore, Ahmed today will be discussing his book, wherein he argues that, of course, he will be talking about it more. He finds problem with both the arguments. We say that Islam is the problem, or colonialism was the problem. You know, both the essentialist approach and the post-colonial or anti-colonial approach to the problem of authoritarianism in Muslim societies. He disagrees with both. He has come up with his own very interesting thesis where he talks about the nexus between the ulema and the state, which undermined the collaboration that was already there between the bourgeois and the intellectuals in those days. This state ulema nexus, which undermined the bourgeois and the intellectual of those times collaboration, was the cause, in fact, for what is happening today, and it continues to happen. So, of course, more on it, Ahmed will elaborate. With this few words of introduction, I welcome Ahmed to our forum, and I thank you for being there. And I'm sure all the participants are looking forward to a very interesting discussion. Over to you, Ahmed. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Fazl Rahman, for this kind invitation. And I truly appreciate the great works of India's Islamic Forum for Moderate Thought. And I'm very happy to be with all of you today. I hope this will be a conversation, a dialogue, that we have some interactions.
Yes.
As we decided with Fazl Rahman, we are going to have three sections. First, I will make the presentation, then we have the conversation,
Yes,
Then we'll have the Q&A.
that's correct. 30 minutes you speak, then 30 minutes you and I have a small conversation on your book, and then we open it up for the questioning. That will be 60-minute session after that. So totally 2 hours.
Yes. So let's start with the contemporary question. Although the book has a very detailed historical explanation, I am not a historian. I'm a political scientist. Therefore, my focus on is today and what is going on today in the world. Out of around 200 countries, about 50 of them, more precisely 49 of them, are Muslim majority countries.
Yes.
And when we look at the world data in terms of democratization, socio-economic underdevelopment, we see a big gap. A gap not only between Muslim majority countries and Western countries, which is obvious, but also Muslim majority countries and the rest of the world. And then this brings a major question about the sources of problems. And when we look at the history of these 49 Muslim majority countries, they had a brilliant civilization. For 5 centuries, Muslims produced cutting-edge polymaths, philosophers, and scholars of many different fields, in addition to being the leading of the world economy from the 8th to 12th centuries. So this makes the question even more puzzling. How come Muslims were so successful scientifically and economically in their early history, but not now? What happened? What explained the rise and fall of Muslims' civilization? So let me show you some slides in my PowerPoint presentation to clarify the data. As you see here, okay, in the world, when we look at Freedom House data, the main data source about democracy and authoritarianism, and 60% of all countries are electoral democracies, fulfill the requirement of very basic necessity of it being a democratic country, elections. But unfortunately, in the Muslim world, the ratio is very low, 14%. So 60% world average, 14% Muslim majority countries. It's about the problem of authoritarianism. When we look at the problem of socioeconomic underdevelopment, the picture is very similar. So the GNIPC, gross national income per capita, Muslim countries have $9,000 in average, whereas the world average 14,000. And this is despite the fact that Muslim countries have 60% of world oil reserves. Many of them are oil rich. Then the literacy rate, 73% versus 84%, schooling less than 6 years, more than 7 years, and life expectancy 66 versus 69. So what explains this gap? When we look at the literature, there are 3 main theories in social science. One is the essentialism. Some call them Islamophobe in more political discourse. Others call them Orientalists, and they blame Islam. From the very beginning to the end, I take this argument very seriously. Max Weber, Samuel Huntington, Bernard Lewis, and others, even some Arab poets and scholars blame Islam, and I engage with this argument and show that they have many weaknesses. They fail to explain cause and effect mechanisms, and historically Islam was perfectly compatible from the 8th to 12th centuries, 5 centuries of compatibility. And moreover, Islam contributed on many ways, as I elaborated in chapter 4 of the book. Then, after criticizing this, I engage with another alternative, post-colonial, anti-colonialist argument, blaming Western imperialism. So, of course, Western imperialism was destructive in Americas, in subcontinent, in the Middle East. So many colonial destruction happened. But it does not explain the core of the problems, because as you see, the golden era of Muslims was between 8 to 11 or maximum 8 to 12 centuries. And then there was a long period of stagnation. Then when Western colonial powers occupy Muslim land, starting late 18th, early 19th century, Muslims already had a stagnant intellectual life, stagnant, even declining economy. So that's why colonization doesn't really capture the gist of the problem. And last but not least, Daren Acemoğlu and others recently published important books about new institutionalism, arguing that if you have good institutions, you have development. If you have bad, extractive institutions, you have underdevelopment. But my main criticism, and a friendly criticism to this one, is that I ask, who makes institutions? Who creates institutions? Institutions are not coming from the heavens. They are not self-surviving entities, but human beings make them, human beings create them. Therefore, we have to look at societies, which class of people make institutions, and ask why Muslims had good institutions in early history, who made them, and then what happened later. So, having criticized these three, I try to develop my own argument. And my argument is basically about the relationship between political, religious, intellectual, and economic class. So, in early Islamic history, from 8th to mid-11th century, Muslims had two dynamic classes: independent scholars and merchants. And these two classes, the intellectual class and economic class, supported each other. They have certain level of collaboration. And that's the time when Muslims were successful. They have the philosophical and economic golden age, quote unquote. But later on, two other classes dominated. I call them the ulema, Islamic scholars. You can say them clergy, mullahs, imams. And Sufi sheikhs had some connections with them. I elaborate in the book. But basically, that's the ulama at the core. And then this ulama was a specific group which ally with the state, which serve the state, which is part of the state power structure after the mid-11th century. And they ally with state authorities, and the state authorities after mid-11th century was also at a particularly military characteristic. So therefore, the alliance between state-serving ulama and military state authorities dominate the Muslim world, marginalize independent scholars and merchants. That led to stagnation and eventual decline. And even today, when we look at major leading Muslim majority countries, from Pakistan to Turkey, from Iran to Saudi Arabia, we see different versions of ulema military state alliance. So a major contribution of the book, at least designed to be, is that many works discuss the problems in the Muslim countries, but with only focusing today and the problems. In my book, I try to show that, no, Muslims had a brilliant era of early achievements. And the Western domination didn't come automatically. It took long time. As you see in this slide, Muslim supremacy, Western supremacy. But in between, from around 1200 to 1700, there is a comparable levels of development, because Muslim philosophical domination ended by almost the end of the death of Ibn Rushd. But from that time until Galileo and Kepler, there is a comparable level. Similarly, economically, there was 5-6 centuries of similarity rather than an immediate Western supremacy. And that's why I define and categorize historical periods as Muslim supremacy comparable level than Western supremacy. So, and throughout the book, I try to emphasize that neither Muslim world nor Western Europe is exceptional. There is no exceptionalism. Societies, religions, countries, peoples are alike. If you have clergy state domination in Europe, you have stagnation, decline, underdevelopment. And in fact, Europeans knew it before Muslims learned. Throughout the so-called Dark Ages, early Middle Ages, for 5-6 centuries after the fall of Rome to Renaissance, there was a clergy-state alliance in Western Europe. There was the marginalization of bourgeoisie and intellectuals in Western Europe. But after mid-11th century, somehow the roles shifted. There was a reversal. Muslims embraced clergy-state alliance, marginalized bourgeoisie and intellectuals, whereas Western Europe experienced the rise of bourgeoisie, city-states, Florence in Italy, Spain, elsewhere, and the rise of universities, allowing the emergence of an intellectual class. And that's how this intellectual and bourgeoisie in Europe achieved Renaissance, Reformation, printing revolution, industrial revolution, scientific revolution, whereas the Muslim world stuck in a religiously political domination with no creativity, no competition, at least a very minimum degree. So let me elaborate this argument after summarizing it. What do I mean by independent scholars? I mean both philosophers like Farabi and Ibn Sina and Muslim scholars, religious scholars like Abu Hanifa. So Abu Hanifa, for example, was a silk merchant and an independent scholar. So therefore he represents both classes. And he paid a price to be independent, to remain independent, because the Abbasi Caliph invited him to be judge. Abu Hanifa refused. He wanted to be financially and otherwise independent of political authority. And then the Caliph insisted, asked him to give a reason to explain why he is unwilling. Then Abu Hanifa said, I am not qualified. Then the caliph or the ruler of the time became angrier, and he said, you are a liar, you are lying. And Abu Hanifa replied, a liar can never be judged. Then the furious ruler put him in prison, and unfortunately Abu Hanifa was poisoned to death. And his attitude represents a class of scholars, their general understanding, because after the Prophet himself and the four caliphs, there happened a separation between religious and political authorities. Major reason was the civil war between Muawiyah, the governor of Damascus, and Ali, the son-in-law of the Prophet. And since Muawiyah established the Umayyad dynasty as a result of the persecution of the Prophet's family members, Ali, Hassan, Hussein, and then this Umayyad dynasty emerged in a very secular way, a state builder, secular dynasty. Even if they held the title caliph, they didn't have religious authority. And there was only one Umayyad caliph today regarded as religiously good person, Umar bin Abdul Aziz, and he was well known with his piety, and the dynasty let him rule and lived as a caliph only 2 years. Reportedly, he was poisoned to death. It was an exception that proves the rule that Umayyad was a secular dynasty. And Abbasi caliphs didn't have religious authority either. Today, you can see a caliph referred as a religious authority, unlike the early four caliphs who are regarded as religiously important figures. Umayyad and Abbasis were mostly secular, worldly, mundane leaders. And scholars like Abu Hanifa, Ibn Hanbal, Malik, Shafi put a distance between themselves and the state authority. And at that time, philosophers, Harizmi, Razi, Ibn Haytham, Farabi, Ibn Sina, Biruni, received some patronage, but they were intellectually independent because there were no institutions to produce them, no state institutions producing them. And as I will show you numbers, Cohen's 1970 article reported 3,900 Islamic scholars between the 8th and mid-11th centuries. Only 9% of them were state officials, received money, salary from the state. 91% of Islamic scholars at that time had private funding themselves and or their families, mostly received money from commerce. They were merchants, but they had a large variation of jobs, from being having a barber shop, being a porter, very basic jobs, but private jobs. Yes, there are 9%, and one of them was Abu Hanifa's student, Shaybani, and Abu Yusuf, but they were not the majority, they were not the dominant. The dominant attitude and understanding is to put a distance between themselves and the state authority. And this distance helped diversity, intellectual, a certain level of freedom that did not exist in Western Europe at that time. So Muslims became economically productive. They innovated such institutions and tools like check that we use today, and certain banking mechanisms at that time. And scientifically, they learned mathematical formulas and numbers from India and developed and taught it to Western Europe, that Westerns today know Arabic numerals originating in India, and Muslim scholars taught to Western Europe. And Ibn Haytham, for example, produced the early version of camera obscura that we use as camera today, dark room, he invented. Ibn Sina's works on medical sciences were translated to Latin and taught in European universities for about 6 centuries. Biruni wrote a very famous book on India and in India's language culture as almost the first anthropologist of the time. Harazmi was very important in math, and Razi was a major medical genius, differentiating certain viruses and bacteria. So that's the Muslim world. Different people contribute. It wasn't simply Muslims. There were atheists, agnostics, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, Hindus, Buddhists contributing to the Muslim civilization at that time. It was tolerant enough to accept and encourage contributions of others. And it was very much unlike the Western Europe, which was at that time had no city like Baghdad, no philosopher like Ibn Sina in Western Europe. Then what happened? Then came mid-11th century. Mid-11th century was an important period of rupture, a critical juncture, which left a legacy of a pet dependence, institutional and ideological continuity. It was a time when structural conditions brought different dimensions of change with certain level of agency of change. So let me summarize very briefly. Economically, Abbasids in the 10th century had a major problem. Declining fertility of Iraqi fields and other reasons make their treasure shrinking. And Abbasi rulers started to allocate land revenue and land tax farming to their military and civilian bureaucrats because of the shortage of cash. And that developed the Iqta system of land revenue allocation to state officials. And then came the Buyuts, the Shia military force capturing Baghdad, and the Buyuts also used Iqta system. Then came the Seljuk Empire, the Turkish nomadic Sunni empire, and they even expanded this iqta system, making the basis of military commanders' salary payment by tax farming and land revenue distribution. And this created a semi-feudal, not totally feudal, it's still better than the feudal system in Western Europe for many reasons, but it replaced the previously dynamic monetary economy, and it limited the private dimensions of Muslim economy. And it led to eventual marginalization of merchants. And when merchants were marginalized, who would fund scholarship? The state not only control economy, especially under Selçuks, but also tried to control religious realm. And a major Grand Vizier, Prime Minister you may call today, of the Selçuks, Nizam al-Mulk, initiated a network of madrasas called after himself as Nizamiya madrasas, mostly governed by state authorities, dynasties, their family members, although through waqfs, foundations, there was political control behind it. And this turned Islamic scholars, ulema, into state servants. Rather than independent scholars, now we have an emerging class of state-serving ulama. And a major product of this network of madrasas was Ghazali, the genius who really rebuilt Sunni Islam, had an impact even on Shia Islam, and his ideas are still influential, very influential today. And Ghazali attack the other or the enemies of Sunni orthodoxy. And so let me summarize. There was an economic crisis leading to iqta system, then the marginalization of merchants. There was the rise of madrasa system, and definitely a religious and ideological component where Ghazali really formulated that. Even before Ghazali, about 50 years or so before him, there were two Abbasi caliphs, Qadir and Qaim. And these were father and son. They ruled 50 years as Abbasi caliphs. But their rule was symbolic, like the Pope in Vatican today, because the Buyids controlling Baghdad. These caliphs wanted to revive their authority, at least the Sunni authority, because as you see in this map, at that time, Shia dynasties control throughout Middle East and North Africa. Fatimids in today's Egypt and other parts of North Africa, Karmatians in Bahrain and Arabian Peninsula, Hamdanis in Syria and some other places, Buyids in today's Iraq and partially Iran. And Abbasi Caliph Qadir wanted to unite Sunni forces against these Shia dynasties. In order to do that, he declared a creed, basics of his understanding of Islamic faith in a very political way. And in that creed called the Qadri Creed today, he declared certain Shias who criticize Aisha, the Prophet's wife, as infidel. He declared Muslims who argue that the Quran was created, the Mu'tazila, the rationalist Muslim theologians, infidel. And he declared the Muslims who do not practice 5 times a day, etc., infidel. It was really establishing, perhaps the first time in Islam, an orthodoxy. And the punishment of rejection of the orthodoxy was death. So this call was well received by Mahmud Ghaznavi, but Mahmud was not able to come to Baghdad. Then later, Selçuks came to Baghdad, re-established Sunni military dominance in the city, and they embraced this Qadiri creed at least some level. And there was a cooperation between the Selçuk sultans and Abbasi caliphs, and together they built the Sunni orthodoxy. Then they established the Nizamiya madrasas, Selçuk authorities, And Ghazali was a major product of these madrasas and a major ideologue of Sunni orthodoxy. And he attacked philosophers in Tahafut al-Falasafa, the inconsistency of philosophers, a major book Ghazali wrote. He attacked Shia, especially Ismail Shia. And he criticized also Mu'tazila, the rationalist philosophers. It could have been fine if Ghazali only criticized intellectually. But he also declared the opponents as apostates. For him, the Ismaili Shias are apostates to be killed, and even philosophers. There are 2 pages at the end of his critique of philosophy, and unfortunately, he began the 2 pages conclusion with a question whether philosophers are kafir, they are apostate, and they themselves and their followers are punishable by death. And he said yes, for 3 reasons. Philosophers argue that the word is eternal. They argue that God's knowledge is limited only to big macro things. God is not interested in small details. And then the third, resurrection will be spiritual rather than physical. And because of these 3 arguments, philosophers and their followers are apostates to be killed. And this really created the violent aspect of the Sunni orthodoxy at that time. So Seljuks established this in today's Iran, Iraq. Then came Saladin Ayyubi against the Crusaders. He saved Jerusalem, and he is celebrated in the Muslim world, respected even in Western Europe. But the major role he played was to spread the Seljuk model of ulema-state alliance to Syria, to Palestine, to Egypt under Ayyubi rule, followed by Mamluk rule. And then the map started to change. So I summarize the ideological factors, Sunni orthodoxy, Qadri creed, and economic factors, the Iqta system, political factors, the Seljuk and Ghaznavi military states, and then these structural conditions allow the agency Abbasi Caliph, Seljuk Sultans, Nizam al-Mulk Ghazali, with their institutions, Nizami and madrasas, and the result was the marginalization of independent scholars and merchants. So one major argument is that the Mongols and Crusaders destroyed the Muslim civilization. That explained the decline. My answer in the book, where I have a specific chapter about Mongols and Crusaders, is yes and no. Yes, of course, for 3 centuries, if we add Timur to Mongols, Crusaders, and Timur, they had a negative impact. They destroyed institutions, killed millions of people in major Muslim cities. But my answer is also no, because the problems began before the occupation of these invaders, as I explained, mid-11th century. And the problem continued after them, because after the destruction of Mongols, Crusaders, and Timur, Muslims geopolitically, militarily recovered. They established 3 major empires, Ottoman, Safavi, Mughal, but they never recovered intellectually, economically, which shows that the problem was not simply occupation, it was much more ideological, institutional, a mentality problem. And in addition to that, these invaders unintentionally contributed ulema-state alliance, because when people face massacres, occupation, trauma, they emphasize survival and automatically turn their face to military leaders such as Saladin. Because if you have an existential threat, if your survival is under threat, you don't look for good art, paintings, musics. You look for military hero to protect you. And the military hero came on in the form of Saladin. Then Saladin let a military oligarchy rule major Muslim lands like Egypt, Palestine, Syria, the Mamluks. Meantime, there was a scholar like Ghazali of Iraq. We now have Ibn Taymiyyah of Egypt. And in the late 13th, early 14th century, Ibn Taymiyyah wrote a major book about how to rule based on Sharia. In that book, he reinterprets the important phrase in Quran, ulul amri minkum, those who have authority among you. So the Quran emphasizes a group of people and ask other Muslims have respect to them. So that this phrase in the Quran have been interpreted differently. Those who have authority among you, authority based on what? Authority based on knowledge, expertise, experience, wisdom. But Ibn Taymiyyah defined this as umara and ulama, or ulama and state rulers. Umara, basically state rulers. And basically ulema-state alliance now find itself a verse in the interpretation of Ibn Taymiyyah. So, don't let me wrong, the Muslim intellectual production did not end overnight in the mid-11th century. Nothing end overnight. Even if you drive a car very fast, you put the brakes, it takes time to stop, right? So Muslim civilization, with all its brilliance, all its speed, was going, and then something happened in mid-11th century, but it continued to go, continued to produce such scholars as Ibn Rushd and Ibn Khaldun in the 13th and 14th centuries. But if you analyze Ibn Rushd and Ibn Khaldun, Ibn Rushd was the Iberian or Spanish Muslim scholar, and Ibn Khaldun is in the North Africa, Tunisia, then Egypt, though he had an Andalusian ancestry. When you look at these two, and I try to elaborate them in my book in details, how Muslims ignore them, how Muslims react them. In the case of Ibn Rushd, it was more traumatic because his books were burned, he was put in exile. Ibn Khaldun didn't receive such nasty reaction, but he was forgotten for a long time until to be rediscovered by Europeans. And how these two major figures let a very little mark in Muslim intellectual life show the apathy, the stagnation, this indifference because of the ulema-state alliance, dominate philosophers and also merchants. In Egypt, for example, there were Kerimi merchants, a group of Muslim, Jewish, and some Christian merchants making intercontinental trades under Fatimids very long time. But they were marginalized by the Mamluk authority. So there are many ways of testing this argument. And one data provided by a Canadian scholar, Shaz Miller, in her 1993 book, she coded all the occupational terms reflecting class relations in Egypt and eastward Muslim lands and categorized in two periods of time. One is between 8th to 11th centuries, the other from 12th to 15th centuries. When you look at the occupational terms like bank manager today or chief financial officer, etc., in today's terminology, 233 occupational terms in the term I call Golden Age. Then in the stagnation era, it declined slightly, 220, as you see in the table. But in the same period of time, the state occupational terms, bureaucratic and military elite, jumped from 97 to 300. And for ulema, in the education, legal, and religious realm, from 33 to 180. It shows how ulema-state aligns have much more capacity, details, profession, money, and producing occupational terms for itself. So, as I mentioned, after the Mongol and Crusader invasions, Muslim geopolitically recover, and they established three empires, Ottoman, Safavid, Mughal. Militarily, politically, very powerful. But at that time, Western Europe was experiencing multiple revolutions, Renaissance, Reformation, geographical discoveries, scientific revolution, printing revolution, industrial revolution was almost coming. And Europe was using three main instruments throughout this revolutionary era: gunpowder, nautical compass, printing press. They learned them mostly from China. These are all Chinese inventions, right? But make them more effective and use them very effectively. Out of three, Muslims only use gunpowder. That's why famous historian Marshall Hodgson called these three empires gunpowder empires. But they did not use nautical compass effectively because all three were mostly army-based empires. Only Ottomans had an effective navy. Even in the case of Ottomans, it was mostly military, not commercial fleet. And it was focusing on strategic geopolitical gains rather than mercantilism and economic gains. And none of them used printing press for about 300 years. So what explains this? Again, the class relations, because in the ruling table, negotiating table, policy-making table of Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals, there were army commanders and ulema, but there were no major figures representing economic interests of merchants, intellectual interests of philosophers. Therefore, these imperial policymakers pick up gunpowder, which was very helpful for the military commanders. But there was no commercial mind to pick up the importance of nautical compass. And when it comes to printing press, for military commanders, it was not an important instrument. The only class who could understand the importance of printing press was the ulema. But unfortunately, the ulema regarded it as a threat rather than as a benefit, rather than an opportunity. So they block the adaptation of printing press. What is the result? The result is that when the Ottoman Christian and Jews had the printing press very early, late 15th, early 16th century, the Muslims can get it only after 287 years after Gutenberg. And throughout the 18th century, when Ottomans finally had a printing press, Ottoman Muslims, as a result of the confirmation of the Sultan and a fatwa by Shaykhul Islam, the chief ulama of the Ottomans, and the Shaykhul Islam, the chief ulama, only allow non-religious books to be printed. It took many decades to get a permission to print religious books. Then it takes another series decades to get a permission to print the Quran. And it took the Turkish Republic to get the permission to print a translation of the Quran. So ulama put a barrier in each and every step. What is the result? The result is that in the 18th century, when Ottomans finally had some printing presses, they published only 50,000 copies of some books. Whereas in the same century, Western Europeans printed 1 billion, so 20,000 times more, 50,000 versus 1 billion, not million, billion books in Western Europe. And what is the impact? Estimated literacy rate in early 1800s, Ottoman Muslims, 1% literacy rate. Whereas in Western Europe, the average estimated literacy rate at that time is 31%. And even today, remember the slide I showed at the very beginning of the presentation. Today, there is a literacy gap between Muslim world average and Western Europe average, even the world average. And we cannot understand that if we don't know the historical backgrounds of the problem of illiteracy in the Muslim world, because of the fact that Muslims didn't get printing press for 300 years, because of the fact that they were dominated by the ulema-state alliance. So after this big gap between literacy using printing presses, Europe experienced a multi-level of development. They dominated the whole world and colonized almost entire world, including Muslim world. As you see in this map, the Russian colonization of Central Asia and Caucasus, French colonization of West Africa, British colonization of the subcontinent, even Netherlands, a small country, colonized a country as big as Indonesia today. Of course, Muslims tried to reform themselves, at least from 1839, which is the Tanzimat in the Ottoman Empire, the Reformation Edict, which declared that the Ottoman Sultan now respecting its subjects' life, property, and honor. So, you know, the John Locke's life, property, and liberty. Liberty was still not in Ottoman documents. Instead of liberty, they put honor. But finally, they say we respect private property because until 1839, it was a random policy of Ottoman Empire to confiscate private property. In this Tanzimat document, finally the Ottoman governors, the Sultan and the bureaucrats say, we will stop confiscating private property. But it's too late because Europeans appreciate private property centuries before, which allowed the growing of merchant class, bourgeoisie, and then all the developments. But even after 1839, even if Tanzimat document declare Ottomans still violated private property. And even today in Turkey, private property is not under protection. The state can confiscate companies, declaring individuals and companies as terrorists and confiscate its properties. This is a major problem because there is no economic class to limit the state, to impose the state, the protection of private property. So the reformists from the 1839 to present had some achievements, but many failures. Why? Because most reform attempts from Turkey's Mustafa Kemal Atatürk to Egypt's Cemal Abdel Nasser came from military leaders. And as you see in my presentation, military leaders are mostly part of the problem. They are not the part of the solution. They have hard time to understand the importance of intellectuals and bourgeois. They are mostly statists. an anti-intellectual. And after these authoritarian, military-led secular experiments, Muslim world turned into more Islamization, at least with the Iranian Revolution. Then came Islamization of Egypt and Pakistan. And finally, even in Turkey today, there's an ongoing process of Islamization. Socio-political, I don't mean personal piety, I mean political Islamization. And the ulema-state alliance revive itself again. Today, for example, in Turkey, there are about 100,000 mosques. Every imam in mosque is paid by Diyanet, a government agency, and all the sermons on Friday sermons are based on a standard text decided at the central headquarters of Diyanet in Ankara, very standardized, very centralized. And Diyanet is now a major political ally of Erdogan as a political figure, not only as the state leader, but also party leader. He receives support of this huge religious organization. So therefore, there is definitely a continuity between what happened in mid-11th century ulema-state alliance emergence and what is going on today. There's a major, substantial, very deep historical continuity. So let me summarize the argument and wrap up by looking the economic dimension. As you may remember, at the beginning, there was iqta system where the ulema state received land and agricultural money, because neither ulema nor state is a productive class. They always need a rent. And historically, it was the iqta system in the Ottoman Empire, Tamar system, agricultural revenue. Today, it's mostly oil revenue. As you see in this table, out of 49 Muslim majority countries, more than 20 of them are rentier states, because 60% of oil revenues in the world are in Muslim countries, and rentier states basically use oil, diamond, gold, and other minerals instead of their people's taxation, and they are more likely to be authoritarian than non-rentier states. And this is a major source of revenue for ulema-state alliance in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, in other countries. And even if countries like Turkey are oil poor, they still receive money from oil-rich countries. Turkey is receiving substantial money from Qatar and trying to find other sources of revenue other than oil, like selling Istanbul piece by piece, its lands, turn them into rent. So ulema-state alliance therefore use oil rents to reproduce itself. So to conclude, Islam doesn't really essentially reject religion-state separation, and it's not the culprit in the analysis of problems. Colonization is not the primary cause of the Muslim decline. Although it is destructive, it's not the core of the problems. Authoritarian and ineffective institutions are created by ulema-state alliance. They didn't come out of blue. They were made by two groups, two classes, ulema class and state class. And this alliance provide ideology and power to really maintain and reproduce ineffective and authoritarian institutions. So this is my presentation, and I'm looking forward to my conversation and then Q&A. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ahmed, for that wonderful presentation. Quite enlightening, and it was filled with so many facts, and I'm sure the participants will have to read your book and get the reality of what is happening across the Muslim world today. You know, the ulama state alliance still there in many countries, even in countries which are not Muslim. You know, for instance, even in India, we feel that there is some understanding, you know, where these people kind of statements that they make and put out in the media sometimes makes people wonder. I mean, I mean, what connections are there? But we do not know. There's no evidence for that. But still, the kind of alliances that they've established in Muslim nations, of course, has been the cause of the downfall of the Muslim community, Muslim societies across the globe. And in fact, you mentioned in your book, about how there were three scholars during that period. You mentioned Sayyid Bey Ali Muhammad Razik and Jamal al-Banna. And these people had their own views. In fact, Jamal al-Banna's book on Islam, which says, Islam al-Islam deen wa umma walaysa deenan wa dawla. So Islam, he says that Islam is about religion and ummah. Islam is not about state. And he said Prophet was a messenger, not a ruler. So how would you bring their views into the equation, and how relevant are they today in trying to break this state ulama alliance in Muslim societies?
Thank you. An important question. You're right. In the introduction, I discuss the contemporary understanding of ulema-state alliance. And I say there is a perception that there's no separation between Islam and state, or in Islam, there's no separation between religion and state, unlike Christianity. Then I say, look, this is a misperception, because in Christianity, there is no such thing as church-state separation theologically frozen. It's very changing, very dynamic process. In early church history, there was a strong clergy-state alliance. Then came 11th century Reformation. And it was not a reform based on what Jesus says in gospel. Because today, Bernard Lewis and other Orientalist scholars argue that Jesus in Bible says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar, render unto God what is God. That's the reason of church-state separation. It's not. Because in my first book, as you kindly mentioned at the introduction, I analyzed French secularism. It took centuries in France to finally separate church and state in 1905. And the church condemned the law, attacked the law. And in 1877, the Pope Pius declared that there are a large number of damned ideas, and one of them is that church and state should be separated. So Catholic Church until 1964 never accepted as an ideal the separation idea. They always wanted to have a privileged status, some combination, established position, etc. And in the Christian history, it's an accident, unintended consequence that in the 11th century, the popes tried to dominate political realm, make the Pope the supreme leader of entire Europe. Then the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, and then his son, the German kings of Holy Roman Emperor, tried to dominate entire Europe by putting the king at the top, then the Pope under him, like the Byzantium model. But neither side was able to dominate the other. They both failed. As a result of this failure, the separation between church and state emerged as an accident. It's not a theological result of Christianity. If it was, look at the Orthodox Church in Byzantium, in Russia. The church leader is always a junior partner of the king. So this is Christianity, and too much misunderstanding about Christianity versus Islam. They are not so different. They're similar. And both Islamophobes argue this to criticize Islam, that Islam is different. It's not Christianity. You cannot separate. And Islamists also argue that. And Islamists and Islamophobe are on the same page. They support each other. They share ideas. They are like. So that's the issue. Then historically, in the presentation, I try to emphasize that there was certain level of separation. Then historically it changed. And let me directly address your question. If this is the case, why didn't other scholars mention it? They did mention it. In 1924, the Minister of Justice in the new Turkish Republic was Seyit Bey. And Seyit Bey was a scholar of Islamic fiqh, Hanefi Sunni fiqh, or Islamic law. And as the Minister of Justice, he gave a presentation in the Turkish parliament and said that we have to abolish the caliphate. Because caliphate is a historical institution and it basically means governing Muslims, and now it is the duty of the parliament. Therefore, we don't need an Ottoman caliph, a member of the dynasty. And second, in the First World War, when Ottoman caliph declared jihad together with Germans against British and French, only Indian Muslims help us, send us money and provide support. But Muslims in Middle East didn't care much. There was the Arab revolt, etc. It shows the Ottoman Caliphate has no resonance in the Middle East. And then the third, if we take it literally, there is a hadith saying that the Caliph is from Quraysh and the Ottoman leaders are not from Quraysh. So then the parliamentarians voted yes as a result of this very convincing speech of a Muslim scholar from a religious point of view. Atatürk supported it for secular reasons, but the main defender of the abolishment of caliphate, generally misunderstood and ignored, was a Muslim scholar with an Islamic argument. So a year after that, in Egypt, Cairo, a graduate of Al-Azhar, Abdul Razak, wrote a very influential pamphlet. It's a short book about caliphate. And he said that caliphate is a historical construction. It's not a religious duty. And it's a later invention. And the verses in the Quran about caliphate is about the duty of human beings. Adam was caliph, as human beings are the representative of God's mission among animals, etc. It's not a political institution. And he said, look, the history of Umayyads and Abbas is all about violence, corruption, political ambition. I don't see any religious point in this caliphate. But what happened? Immediately after the publication of Abdul Razak's short book, Al-Azhar Council of Ulema cancel his license and degree. He says, you are no longer a graduate, you no longer have a university degree, you cannot function as a judge. He lost his job. And this level of censorship. So they didn't let him to speak and defend himself. They just, and I read the decision after Al-Azhar. It's a very, very redundant, boring, and no inspiration whatsoever. They just say, you can write a book against the idea of caliphate, and we just cancel your degrees. It's very unfortunate and show how there is lack of freedom of thought and freedom of speech among the ulema circles. If a young ulema write a book, they just throw it away. So this is the second. The third one, more recent, as you mentioned, and Al-Banna, and interestingly, Jamal Al-Banna, so he is the younger brother of Hassan Al-Banna. Yeah. And the book only has the Arabic version. Unfortunately, it has not been translated to English. And as you rightly put so, he says Islam is religion and ummah rather than religion and state.
Yeah.
We have to look at the community. As a community, we have responsibility. We are not egoistic individuals, but politics is corrupt and it's corrupting. If we as Muslims focus and obsess with political power, we will lose our moral entity. And the Prophet and the four caliphs are exceptional figures. And I agree with him and try to argue in the book that the model Prophet and then the following four caliphs provide us is inspirational, but it's not to be repeated because there is no prophet among us. There is no person among us who has direct connection with even the prophet himself. That's why the model cannot be repeated. Only a fake one would mislead us. So
Yes.
that's the long answer to your important
Yeah,
question.
no, in fact, I might entirely agree with your last part of the answer, which says that, such a caliphate is not possible today. I know, because you can't get people like the Prophet, obviously you can't. Then you can't even get people like the four Khalifas. I mean, people of such impeccable character. So how would you produce a caliphate of that kind today, even if the caliph was to come from the Quraysh? It's impossible. So any people dreaming of a caliphate today, they just have to dream about it. It's impossible to establish such a caliphate. It's not possible. But what I would like to explore further, Ahmed, is, when you say that there is no separation of state and church in Islam, how would you justify it theologically from the Quranic perspective? Because I don't want to go into the hadiths, because scholarship has now revealed that all the hadiths pertaining to the caliphate or the sectarianism evident in that, where they say that the caliph has to be from the Quraysh. In fact, there are other hadiths which prophesy the takeover of Constantinople by Sultan Muhammad, in 1453. There are hadiths even which talk about it. That is, they are quoted. So, but now scholarship has revealed, like Wilfred Madlung and many others have written, that these were what they call ex post facto compositions during that period after the second what do you call the second civil war or the second fitna, which happened in 690, around 690, where the early Umayyad Caliphate was being questioned. They were being attacked, and Yazid and the other people were questioned by Zubair ibn Zubair. And therefore, how would you say that these hadiths basically were created to justify their respective positions or the claims to caliphate in those days? So, and now they are being used by even the Turkish people to say that what Muhammad did was prophesied in the hadith. What kind of a conqueror would he be? The hadith says, who conquers Constantinople, and no, just impossible. How could nobody knows the ghaib? Only Allah knows al-ghaib, the unseen or the future. Nobody knows the future. And yet we have hadiths where the Prophet predicts centuries, what happens centuries after him, which is not possible. It goes against the Quran. So therefore, how do you say? Because again, insofar as the church is concerned, the church was the state. There was no separation between church and state in those days, as you rightly said, because the church was the state.
Yeah.
They were ruling. It was the kings who wanted to come and take back the power, or the right. So, but that's the reason why they had to separate, just to push the church away. But in Islam, there's nothing in the Quran which, as far as I have studied, which kind of supports the idea that there is no separation between the church and the state. So how would you justify it from a theological perspective?
Thank you. Let me briefly mention that if Muslims think that it's good to see some political unification as European Union has been trying to do, etc. Politically, that's fine. I'm not opposed to that. Any level of collaboration, cooperation, intellectually, they can organize soccer games, sportive collaboration. Just do it. But we don't see any serious collaboration among Muslims. Even, for example, today you see in China, Uyghur Muslims face a persecution. There is no serious support, humanitarian, human rights point of view. Even Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran is not supporting the human rights of Uyghurs. But when it comes to rhetoric, there is too much talking. Our eyes don't see anything real. Our ears are full of rhetoric. That's a major problem. of being hypocritical, not really being consistent and serious and sincere. From a theological point of view, you are right that the Quran is mostly silent about politics, other than about commanding the good and forbidding the evil, and some legal verses about certain legal issues, but how to rule, how to impose political authority, it's mostly silent. That's why the scholars emphasize the phrase ulul emri minkum. And for Mawardi, so there are only two books about caliphate. One is written by Mawardi in mid-11th century. It was commissioned by Abbasi Caliph, who see his position weakened and ask Mawardi to write a book emphasize the importance of caliphate. So therefore Mawardi's books is very political, reflecting the political interests of certain group of people of the time. And he interprets ulul amri minkum as the caliphate's political authority. 3 centuries later came Ibn Taymiyyah with the second book, How to Rule Based on Sharia. And things change because Mongols destroy Abbasi Caliphate. And the Mamluks, of course, not Quraysh, not Arab, they are mostly Turkish, Circassian. And then he tried to justify, and then he said, ulama and umara, alims, the plural ulama, and the state, they are ulul amri minkum. It's just interpretation. So since there is nothing in the Quran, they fabricated the hadith.
Yes.
And unfortunately, we see this fabrication in Ghazali's books, in Razi's writings. Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin and Al-Iqtisad fil I'tiqad, but what includes this fabricated hadith, which says religion and state are twins. They are twin brothers. Religion is the foundation, state is the guardian. That doesn't have the foundation destroys, and that doesn't have the guardian perishes. So, and many books refer this as a hadith. Then I look at the origin, and in my book, you see in every chapter I use this because you can trace it throughout Islamic history. And it is a Sasanian Persian maxim. It is a proverb or a maxim or advice by the Sasanian king Ardashir. And he asked his son to follow certain advices, and then one important of them is religion-state brotherhood, quote unquote, from Ardashir, translated in 7th, 8th centuries to Arabic, then used. And many political statements in Islamic books are Persian Sasanian ideas. So by Persian Sasani, I don't mean they are bad. They may be good, inspirational, but they are not from the Prophet of the Quran. Why do we keep saying that as if they are religious things? So, one of them is that very famous in Turkey. Unbelief will continue, but despotism will not.
Yes.
People in Turkey repeat it as a hadith, but this is again a Persian Sasanian maxim. It may be something good, but it has nothing with Islam. So, in fact, as you rightly put, so they try to justify by theology, by the Quran, by the hadith. But the fact that they fabricated the hadith show there is nothing to justify. That's why they are borrowing from the Persian old wisdom, because Islam is very silent about it. And even if Islam says something, are Muslims really listening? Because, for example, there is an hadith about the negativity of despotism. It's very frequently recited that the good ruling will only continue 30 years, 3 decades after me. Then comes a despotic monarchy.
Yes.
So if you ask to Saudis and others, you have a monarchy, but there's a hadith against monarchy. How do you reconcile? They
Yes.
interpret, they make tawil, they make some explanations. But
Yes.
monarchy, for example, a hereditary dynasty, has nothing to do with Islam. The four caliphs, none of them was the father and son of each other, right? How come
Yeah.
many Muslim countries are ruled by hereditary monarchy? If they really listen to Islam, things would be different. But anyhow, so Islam is, what I understand is about egalitarianism. This is very important. And at the very beginning, when Islam emerged, it was revolutionary because in India, you know better than me, there was historically the caste system. In Sasanian, very classified society, Byzantium, elite and the masses, major distinction. The Prophet Muhammad came with certain egalitarian message, and the Quran mentioned that the superiority is only with taqwa, the belief and piety and goodness. There is no priority and superiority based on nobility, right? But this is the message, right? Mawardi, again, the mid-11th century scholar, in his famous book on caliphate, has a series of propositions. And one proposal he has is that the caliph should establish an office of genealogy, of nobility, which will not allow women from noble class to get married with a man from lower class. So what is the source in Islam? There is no source whatsoever. But this is how Muslims later on destroyed the egalitarian message of Islam, making it a defender of nobility, class relations, etc. So these are the basic things, but you are right that there is really nothing to
Yeah.
find about authoritarianism, about killing the apostate, about these
Yes.
kind of illiberal things in the Quran.
Yes.
And the hadith you refer to is generally, it was supposed to defend the Yazid, the son of Muawiyah, who get Prophet's grandson
Yeah.
Hussein murdered, right?
Yes. Yes.
So they propagandate this hadith, that there's a hadith about the commander of the leader who will conquer Constantinople. And if Yazid was able to conquer Constantinople, they were going to use this hadith to clarify him, purify him from Karbala, killing the Hussein, grandson of the Prophet. But Yazid failed to conquer Constantinople, then the whole project collapsed.
So, as you rightly said, everything was created and fabricated to sustain their rule, to sustain their authoritarianism that they were trying to perpetuate. So, I mean, therefore, we need to completely ignore these kind of hadiths and go back. That's also an important thing for Muslims to do today. Stop believing in these kind of fabricated hadiths and go back to the original teachings of the Quran. And that's what the Prophet came to follow. And since we are talking about the nexus between the ulama and the state, and you mentioned that in your book, it was after the 11th century the whole thing became problematic, this nexus, because before the 11th century, from the 8th century onwards, when Mamun established that Bait al-Hikmah, now if you look at Bait al-Hikmah, it was a repository of every kind of knowledge. Books from India, book from China, Greece, and all over the world are brought there and translated. And the head of the translation movement was a Christian, right? I mean, and they had no discrimination. There were Jewish quarters in Baghdad. There were Zoroastrians living in Baghdad, and that period saw a time when there were about 70 libraries. Even Cordoba at that time had 70 libraries, and the biggest library had about 225,000 books at that period of time. And recently, you mentioned about how a printing press was not allowed in Turkey because the ulama felt that their authoritarianism, their power would go away if other books are printed, and they kept the Muslim world away from books because they didn't want to get them. So therefore, how would we break this nexus once again and try to bring back that kind of a what do you call an open society which existed in the from the 8th to 11th century, especially which is symbolized by the existence of that powerful institution called or most intellectual institution or university called the Bait al-Hikmah. I mean, this is an amazing institution. How can we bring it back to it? What can we do, or what should we do that? And after this, perhaps we'll open it up for questions. After
Of course, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think so we have to be honest. We stop being apologetic, because imagine yourself as a medical doctor and a patient came to you with arguing that she didn't have any sickness, any illness whatsoever. How can you treat such a patient? So confession, acknowledgement, acceptance is the first step. And when we acknowledge our problems today, it will help us to find the solution. And my message in the book is that Muslims do not simply have to imitate Western model. They have their own model in their history. And in fact, when Western Europe was closed-minded, was intolerant and close to diversity, it was the Muslim world which was tolerant, open to diversity. Let me give you an example. In 9th century Baghdad, in 9th and 10th century, the Muslims established the biggest hospital possibly in the world at the time.
Yes.
And the chief medical doctor was a Christian. And many medical doctors were Christian and Jews. 4 centuries after that, Muslims established the Mansour Hospital in Cairo, Mamluks, 4 or 5 centuries after that. And then this Mansour Hospital, a major achievement of the time, put in the foundational document that non-Muslims cannot be a doctor or even a patient. Such an exclusionary attitude. So we have to acknowledge this problem. Instead of becoming more open-minded, unfortunately, Muslims becoming more close-minded in 5 centuries. We have to analyze it. What is the source? A major explanation is the Mamluk reaction to Crusaders, because Crusaders were really violent, destructive, and then the Mamluks in Egypt were very much defensive. They fought against the Mongols, almost coming, and then the Mamluks defeated the Mongols first time in military history. They were also originally coming from Saladin's legacy, fighting against the Crusaders. But we have to understand that these political conditions make them more close-minded. And Ibn Taymiyyah has some fatwas against Nusayris in Syria, for example, because he regarded Mongols, Crusaders, and then heterodox Muslims like Nusayris and other Druze, a potential collaborator of Christians, Crusaders, and Mongols. That's why he had very negative and hostile ideas. And how come Muslims today use these ideas of Ibn Taymiyyah and others who were, so Ibn Taymiyyah, we can understand him as a child of his time, as a reaction to his political condition. But no one can understand us today in 2020 if we repeat the same wrong ideas, because no longer we live in 13th century. This is a new century with new conditions. And today Muslims really should be the promoter of tolerance, dialogue, coexistence, because it's the good way, morally, ethically good and right position. It's the main message of Islam. And there are many Muslim minorities. I myself, for example, live in the United States. Muslims here are a minority. And there are many Muslim minorities all around the world. And promoting the idea of coexistence, multiculturalism, will be beneficial for Muslims everywhere. But the important thing is to be honest and consistent. It should be theoretically and philosophically consistent idea. If you defend peace and coexistence when you are weak, and then if you change your idea when you become powerful, then you are a hypocrite. And I have in my book a detailed critique of Sayyid Qutb and his notorious book, Milestones. He argues that the Prophet defending peace when he was a minority and weak, but the real message of Islam is offensive jihad. And then the Prophet started to defend it when he became powerful. This is the most notorious idea.
Absolutely.
You make the Prophet someone who manipulates his ideas based on power relations. This is unacceptable. And if Muslims defend such notorious ideas, no one would trust us. No one wants to live with us. They say you are not trustworthy because you have one language when you are weak and minority. You have a different language when you are majority and powerful. This is the worst thing happening.
Absolutely. I could agree with you more on that, because that's what we're exhibiting everywhere today. Look at even my own country. See, my neighboring country has this blasphemy law. People get killed there for blasphemy law, and people get killed in courtrooms, and yet not a word of condemnation comes from any ulama. From not a single alim condemns it. In fact, most of them justify it. So therefore, this silence will build only mistrust. They will feel that when Muslims they become powerful, they will do exactly that. So people don't trust us because of this. So unless we change, acknowledge our faults or wrongs in the past, and are willing to question those mindsets and willing to stand up against those views, then people will stop trusting us. Then they can't be trust. Islamophobia would only spread. I entirely agree with you on this.
And let me very briefly mention that I agree with you, and blasphemy in Pakistan and elsewhere is a very dangerous trend. The Prophet never executed someone for being an apostate. They narrate a hadith which contradicts itself, because it says, kill the one who changed his religion.
Yes.
It doesn't make sense because the Muslims changed their religions from paganism to Islam.
Yeah.
And then the Quran, what is the advice? It says if you hear them making jokes about the verse of the Quran, if they mock God's words, leave the conversation until they change the topic.
Yeah.
That's the advice of the Quran.
Absolutely. So therefore, I think it is time we Muslims introspected, not just introspected, and we need to make amends for all this, all the wrongs that have occurred, and in fact to grapple them and take them to the scruff of the neck and challenge the existing ideas on that. The existing thought prevailing, the mindset, the anachronism that prevails in a society must be questioned and challenged. Therefore, with this, I like to now open this discussion for more questions. And I mean, if anybody wants to ask, they can raise their hands on the system, in the chat window. Then I will ask you.